My name is Peter Munoz. I'm a member of the Cal Class of 1968, and I want to welcome everyone to today's program, which is sponsored by the Center for Civility and Democratic Engagement, which is founded by the Class of 1968 and housed in the Goldman School of Public Policy. And the Center's goal is to foster civility and cooperation in the democratic process in reaching solutions to the problems that face the state and the nation. Now, we are honored to have in the audience today Dean Henry Brady, who is the Dean of the Goldman School and is also the Faculty Director of the Center.
The President has proposed doing that as well. Thank you.
Well, anyway, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak before you today on the minimum wage issue. And I think given the nature of the debate, I'm hoping there will be a lot of interesting questions in the Q&A section that I can address. Now, one of the things that obviously has come up a lot once I became involved in the minimum wage issue a while ago is the question of how I got involved in it. Because for as most of you probably know, I'm somebody generally characterized as from a conservative Republican background or free market libertarian. And those ideological positions seem entirely discordant with the notion of raising the minimum wage, which has traditionally been presented as a liberal or left-wing type of issue. So I thought I'd give a little bit of my background on it, in that for most of my involvement in public policy over the years, I've never really focused much on economic issues. But then a few years ago, I started thinking about some of the broader problems in our society and the social problems. And it suddenly struck me that a large hike, a major increase in the minimum wage would at a stroke address many of those different problems. And I wrote a major article about it in 2011. And then over the couple of years since then, I ended up speaking and writing a series of additional articles and that sort of thing. The funny thing about it is that the minimum wage in many ways has been so far off the main political radar screen in America for the last 20 or 30 years. Even many liberals or Democrats tended not to focus on it as a central policy proposal, that it really had not become a political football in the debate, in that neither conservatives nor liberals really paid much attention to it. Just to give you an example, Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz are two of the most prominent liberal economists in the United States. Very prominent, very high profile. And yet until about a year and a half ago, neither of them had been willing to publicly come out and support a large increase in the minimum wage. The minimum wage was viewed in many ways by the more academically qualified liberals as something old-fashioned, an old policy proposal, something from the 1930s or 1940s or 1950s. And really the country had shifted away from that sort of issue and had moved much more towards, for example, the earned income tax credit, which David Newmark recently just dealt with a moment ago. Yet, when you really sit down and look at it, I think the minimum wage and a large increase in the minimum wage would solve an awful lot of these different problems and do so much more effectively. The issue we have right now in American society, and one reason I think the minimum wage is something that should be appealing in the right way to a lot of conservatives, is that the current system right now involves massive government subsidies for low-wage or impoverished workers in American society. In other words, people who work full-time in many cases for a living, but earn so little money that they can't survive on their paychecks, and therefore they receive government subsidies in exchange to keep them afloat via the income tax credit, via housing subsidies, via food stamps. The total dollars involved are over $250 billion a year. In other words, the taxpayers are providing massive support for low-wage workers, and they are paying the workers to survive rather than forcing the workers' employers to pay them. And from any logical perspective, whether a liberal perspective or a conservative perspective, that really doesn't make much sense. In other words, it's much better for employers, for businesses to pay their own workers than for the taxpayers to make up the difference. Obviously, that's not something necessarily supported by the businesses themselves and their lobbyists, who have a tremendous amount of influence in Congress. And if you take something like the Earned Income Tax Credit, it really is essentially a government welfare program. It's the notion of the government sending checks to people based on the forms they fill out on their tax returns every year, sometimes with the help of tax advisors who skim off a large chunk of the money involved. And the dollars involved are not at all small. In other words, it's basically, in many cases, 20% or 30% of their entire income coming from the federal government. Now, the point about the minimum wage is if you basically talk about a small increase in the minimum wage, just as David Newmark suggested, it would have relatively little impact on poor families in the United States. In other words, most of the money in many cases would go to teenagers from affluent families. But if you're talking about a large increase in the minimum wage, an increase not of $1 or $2, but $4 or $5 or even $6, the distributional effects are entirely different. For example, in the case of my own proposal, which I've been working to try to put on the ballot, raising the California minimum wage to a figure of $12 an hour, that figure would in effect raise the wages of 40% of all the wage earners in California, which is a very large total. The average wage increase would be $5,000 per year for an impacted worker, $10,000 for a couple. Any full-time worker in California would make a minimum of $25,000 a year, $50,000 a year for a full-time wage earner couple. Those dollars are enough to lift almost all of the families out of poverty. And we're talking about a massive increase in California, the wages involved. The other thing that really struck me as I started looking in the data is that the main impact of a much higher minimum wage would obviously be that the businesses involved, since the impact would be that they would basically have to cover the cost of their workers, they would simply pass on the higher cost to the consumer, and that's entirely true. In other words, if you have a situation where the workers involved were in the tradable manufacturing sector, then there might be the question of foreign competition and the jobs being lost. But the vast majority of minimum wage or low wage workers in California or in the United States tonight are workers who are in the non-tradable service sector, who work at fast food restaurants, who work as agricultural workers, who work at big box retail outlets, that sort of thing. And those jobs cannot be outsourced. They cannot be replaced by foreign competitors. In many cases, they involve personal services that are very expensive and difficult to automate. So the jobs would remain, but the prices would simply go up. And the price increases are extremely negligible compared to what most people would think. For example, studies have shown that Walmart, which is the largest low-wage employer in the United States, with over 1 million lower-wage workers who earn under $12 an hour, they would simply have to raise their prices by 1.1% one time to accommodate the extra costs of a $12 an hour minimum wage. In the case of domestic agricultural products, the price on the store shelves would only go up by about 2%, a one-time increase of 2%, to cover a $12 an hour minimum wage for agricultural workers. In the case of fast food, it would be certainly more than that. But even so, a cheeseburger would only go up by about a dime to the retail buyer of cheeseburgers. And the impact of that would be fairly small, almost negligible, compared to the massive fluctuations, for example, we've seen in other consumer products, like gasoline a few years ago, where the prices sometimes went up by 20 or 30% per year, year after year. So if we're talking about a one-time price increase of 1 or 2%, with the average increase across all goods and services in the United States being probably 0.7%, there really would be relatively little impact in consumer use of those products, and the jobs would still exist. Furthermore, the money going to those families would be probably in the range of, in California, $15 billion a year extra. And if you put an extra $15 billion a year into those low-wage families, they're the households that spend every dollar they earn. And the end result is a massive fiscal stimulus impact, something basically that would drive and revive the California economy, because those are the people who go and shop at Walmart, who go to fast food restaurants and buy there. So we're talking about something that really have a very positive impact. Now, One of the interesting things when you discuss this from an ideological perspective, as I started focusing on the issue a couple of years ago, was that there was much, much less resistance to the notion of a higher minimum wage among my conservative and libertarian friends than the general public would expect. There are many people, for example, who would fight to the death a 0.1% increase in taxes, who are ideologically opposed to any increase in government spending, government tax benefits, all of those distributional programs. But the minimum wage does not fall into that category. The minimum wage, by raising the minimum wage, you automatically cut government spending because the families we're talking about are no longer so poor. They would no longer qualify for food stamps. They would no longer qualify for the earned income tax credit. The government spending on them would decrease, and the taxpayers would therefore save money. On the national level, it probably would be in the range of $40 or $50 billion per year if we're talking about, for example, a $12 an hour minimum wage. Therefore, what you're talking about is simply forcing private employers to cover the wages of their own workers rather than shifting the burden to the taxpayer. That saves the taxpayers money through these cuts in government programs, and it involves none of the ill effects that many of these conservative or libertarian individuals are so concerned about. The only concern most people would have would be whether there would be a lot of job losses involved, because obviously if workers lose their jobs, the impact is the government has to cover their costs through welfare programs or things like that. But the evidence is job losses would be negligible. Take, for example, a couple of months ago, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, came out with a study on the likely impact of the Democratic proposal to raise the federal minimum wage by $10 to $10.10 an hour, and it was touted by opponents of the minimum wage as devastating to the pro-minimum wage case. It basically argued that raising the minimum wage to $10.10 would cost the American economy 500,000 jobs, which sounds like a very large number, but it really isn't. The end result, when you look at, for example, what the CBO study showed, was that of the workers impacted by a minimum wage rise in the United States, the low-wage workers, 98% of those workers would get a wage hike, would increase their incomes. In many cases, increase their incomes by a life-changing amount of thousands of dollars per year. And 2% of those workers might lose their jobs. Now, in a situation where you're talking about a change in government policy, in which 98% of the impacted people benefit and 2% suffer, there are very few government policies that would have such an incredibly positive effect. Furthermore, many of the jobs lost would be lost by the teenagers that David Newmark referred to. And it would be very easy to take a small fraction of the tens of billions of dollars in government savings through decreased social welfare spending and produce something, for example, authorize something like a targeted tax credit in which businesses that hire teenagers would receive a subsidy of $1 or $2 or even $3 per hour. And if you increase the subsidy, you could basically neutralize any of the ill effects of the job losses involved. And in fact, you could probably lower teenage unemployment to a smaller level than it is today. When you have a change in government policy that saves tens of billions of dollars in government spending, you can use a small fraction of the dollars to balance out any of the ill effects. I'm very pleased to see that in the months after I launched my effort and showed that there really was a strong conservative case for raising the minimum wage, you've seen a lot of people get on board with that. For example, Phyllis Schlafly, one of the iconic figures of the conservative right, endorsed a higher minimum wage. Bill O'Reilly, the biggest conservative on Fox News, endorsed it. Walmart, the biggest low-wage employer in America, argue that, it might very well be possible that a raise in the minimum wage would benefit Walmart more than it would hurt Walmart. And Walmart in the past had also advocated a minimum wage. I think there's actually a fairly good chance right now that at least California will see minimum wage legislation pass through the state legislature later this year, possibly raising it to $12 or $13 an hour. And I think the results would be very positive, just as they were in 1996, when California boosted its minimum wage by about 30 or 40%, and unemployment dropped rather than increased. I'll be very glad to answer any questions during the Q&A. Thanks a lot. Well, the problem is there's a collective action problem here, in that I think you can make a very strong case that Walmart and all of its competitors would benefit from a much higher minimum wage. In other words, all they would have to do would be raise the prices by 1% or so one time. The consumers wouldn't mind at all. Meanwhile, the workers who get those higher wages across all of society would be exactly the workers shopping at Walmart, which tends to cater to the lower market community. And that would provide a boom for Walmart and all of its competitors. But it's difficult for any one of them to take that action separately, because Revolution Foods, for example, is, I assume, a fairly small company compared to the size of Walmart. Yeah, exactly. Walmart has, what is it, 1.3 million employees in America? And Walmart's competitors, if Walmart, for example, raised its minimum wage to $12 an hour, but none of its competitors did, Walmart's selling point is that it has rock bottom prices. So a 1% increase isn't serious if all of the competitors also raise their prices by 1%. But if none of their competitors do, then Walmart might really have some problems. If Walmart and all of its competitors got together in a room and agreed to collectively raise their... I'm about to say, and collectively raise their wages to $12 an hour as the starting level, that would be illegal and they'd all go to prison. Therefore, it's needed for the federal government or state governments to provide that legal framework, allowing them to do what they'd want to do. And that's why Walmart, for example, back in I guess it was 2005, the Walmart CEO actually testified before Congress that he wanted the federal minimum wage increased because it would be good for Walmart. Yeah. And that's why they're saying the same thing right now.
And actually, that's why our award winners in our app come with us to Congress saying, we can do this, but
In an equitable way.
Thank you. Ron?
Okay. It seems to me what's really happened over the last 40 or 45 years is that the minimum wage has not only dropped by about 1/3 in inflationary terms, but it's dropped by more like 2/3 relative to per capita GNP. In other words, what we've seen is a total collapse at the low wage level relative to what's happened in our society. Oh, sorry. If you go back 30 or 40 years ago, people could get by on a minimum wage job, and now they can't. And that's a huge problem. At the same time, there's been a gigantic growth in all these complex and expensive government social welfare programs to make up the difference. The problem with it is not only, I think there are negative ill effects to these social welfare programs in general, but the programs are so patchwork and complex. Nobody can even say how much an individual worker gets. In other words, when you're talking about raising the minimum wage, one reason it's difficult to calculate the changes in government spending is there are so many programs, so many complex formulas, nobody can really do the calculation. The nice thing about a much higher minimum wage, it's a very simple, robust policy. In other words, instead of somebody, for example, having to hire a tax preparer and pay them hundreds or even thousands of dollars a year to get their earned income tax credit, which is totally unpredictable otherwise, everybody knows that they would get $12 or $13 or $11 an hour in their paycheck. They would get it every week. It would be spread out through the year, and they wouldn't have the same sorts of problems. The only argument, I think, against a much higher minimum wage is the question of job loss. In other words, would a lot of low-wage workers lose their jobs, which is obviously the concern that David Newmark and a lot of the other people purportedly tend to make. But it seems to me the data shows it's a very small factor. In other words, if you take the worst possible case of hundreds of thousands or 1 million jobs being lost, according to the CBO studies or the other studies with the federal minimum wage hike, we're talking for every 20 or 30 or 50 workers who gets an increase in income of 30% or 50%, life-changing amounts, one worker might lose his job. And the ratio is just enormous. What we're talking about is a situation, if the only downside risk is workers possibly losing their jobs, then why don't we ask the workers involved? In other words, if the only people who could vote on whether to raise the federal minimum wage are those tens of millions of low-wage workers, it would probably pass with 90% of the vote, because they would know that for everyone who might lose his job, there are 30 or 40 who would gain tremendously. And also, if you're losing a $7 an hour or $7.50 an hour job, you're in terrible poverty right now. If you lose your job, you're still in terrible poverty. You're not really losing all that much. Well, on the other hand, if your wage goes up by 50% or 80%, your life has changed entirely. Also, let's look at things at an empirical level. I'm somebody who doesn't have an economics background. You have 500 economists on one side, 500 economists on the other, 600 on the other side. California raised its minimum wage by 35% in 1996. The critics at the time, through an initiative process, Hilda Solis's initiative, the critics said it would destroy the economy, would cause massive unemployment. Instead, unemployment dropped by 1/3 in the 4 years that followed. A huge minimum wage increase, a huge decline in unemployment. Oh, I know. Oh, right, but I'm saying, let's take another case, San Jose. San Jose just raised its minimum wage by 25% a little over a year ago. Again, the critics said it would cause massive unemployment, massive job loss. Unemployment in San Jose dropped by 2 full percentage points in the year that followed. Now, there are all sorts of complicating factors. I'm certainly not saying that proves a huge rise in the minimum wage causes a huge decline in unemployment. But when you see those effects in the 2 empirical cases you have in California, and the case of San Francisco, which had the highest minimum wage in the country and a huge decline in local unemployment, it shows the ill effects can't be nearly as bad as some of the critics make them out to be. So if we're talking about a situation where the beneficiaries or the people who would be impacted by the low-wage workers very much wanted, if the evidence is the loss in unemployment would be relatively negligible, and the impact on the rest of society would be tremendously beneficial, it seems like a very good idea to do.
Feel free to go.
So you actually don't have